that sound of shh is what a growing number of people who identify as Christians or have felt, especially over the last generation or so. Um, that is the silencing and shaming voice of the church,
Mhm.
of the sort of collective Christian conscience, right? That
Mhm.
says you can't say those things, you can't think those things, you can't ask those things. And what I encounter so often in my ministry, and a number of different scenarios, right? So sometimes I'll encounter somebody who's maybe 65 or older in my church who will say, my kids don't come to church. They grew up in the church and they have never returned once they left. And I can't get them to come back. And what I try to explain to them is um, for many of them, the questions that they've had that have gone unanswered or ignored or silenced for so long have finally edged them out completely of that experience. There are others whom I encounter in the church who will say to me, you are saying things in church that I've always thought but have never felt safe to say or ask.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with Mark Feldmeir, who wrote a great book called Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe Anymore. And so, Mark, thanks for this book. Thanks for your work. And thanks for making time for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Glenn. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, definitely. So first thing first, maybe tell us a little bit about what we need to know about Mark, a bit about who you are, what you do, what's your Starbucks order. Tell us
There
all
you
the
go.
things.
Yeah. A grande Americano.
There you go.
That's always my go-to.
Classic.
Yeah. I'm a pastor, a United Methodist pastor, currently serving a church in the Denver metro area in Colorado called St. Andrew, a United Methodist congregation. That's a wonderful sort of laboratory for creative thinking and theology, deeply committed to serving our broader community and the broader world.
Mhm.
I'm originally from Southern California, so served a couple churches in San Diego and in Orange County, California, before coming to Denver in 2014, which was a big move for me and my family, given that we were from Southern California and never thought we'd leave, but had this amazing opportunity to to follow the lure, so to speak,
Yeah,
and come to Colorado. So
yeah.
maybe the most interesting and exciting thing going on right now in my life is my 27-year-old son. We have three kids, but my 27-year-old son, our middle child, is getting married this coming weekend in
Oh,
Cleveland.
great.
So we'll be headed out this week to celebrate with him and his new wife.
That's exciting. So how old are your kids? 27?
My oldest is 30, and she's
Okay.
up in Northern California, and
Okay.
then 27, he's out in Cleveland, and then our youngest is 20, and he's at CU Boulder as a
Okay.
sophomore.
Very nice. Very nice. So you described your church as a lab. I've never heard anybody describe there's in a position of leadership, their church as a laboratory. Take me into that word for just a moment.
Well, I think it's a congregation that is committed to exploring and stretching the boundaries and
Hmm.
the canvases of theological conversation, and and I think expects that out of not just the preacher and leader of the church, but across the board in leadership. And so there's a deep intuitiveness and curiosity about um, seeing the world and seeing the gospel and the
Hmm.
biblical world in different and new ways,
Hmm.
and to not be afraid of that. And so, in some ways, this book, Life After God, partially came out of a lengthy sermon series um, that I did a couple of years ago
Hmm.
that just seemed to spark some interest and some deep conversations that led to me thinking this is an important and bigger conversation that needs to go beyond the walls of my congregation.
Yeah. Now, has the church that you're in, has it always had that kind of laboratory atmosphere, or is that something that evolved as you have been there?
I think the congregation I inherited in 2014
Mhm.
was a deeply a very literate, biblically literate congregation.
Okay.
They had done a great deal of work with under their previous leadership with exploring Scripture
Mhm.
and going very deep and intentional through a Bible study process called Disciple Bible Study, and
Okay.
so I inherited that and brought to it, I think, a different theological lens as we interpret Scripture,
Sure.
um, and to bring people into new spaces and new conversations.
Okay. Awesome. So we're going to get into your book in a moment, but I was wondering if you could give us like the brief overview, elevator pitch of the book, Life After God, because I shared the title with some people and they're like, so it's about leaving God behind completely. And I'm like, no, like it could be that, but I think it's bigger than that. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the title, about the book, and who this book is for.
Yeah. So obviously the title is a bit provocative, and it does have a sense or connotation of leaving the faith, leaving God behind.
Mhm.
Um, the nuance here is that I want to invite people to leave behind a God that no longer works for them, or maybe it has never really worked for them. A God that they've been told about and taught about and expected to believe in that doesn't quite reconcile with their lived experiences in the real world. And those lived experiences, I think, are felt both within the context of what we would say would be modern day orthodoxy and Christianity, but also a lot of those experiences that people are having today, especially those that are younger,
Mhm.
are sort of outside the boundaries of Christian orthodoxy. This idea that we can have these experiences and not even have to give them words, not have to
Mhm.
give them any sort of sacred authority within the church, that they're authoritative on their own and transformative and revealing for them. And yet so often the church tends to build these boundaries around what can be believed and what shouldn't be believed. And so I want to give people permission to rethink, especially some of these major ideas around the nature and the power and the aims of God. So in the book, as you know, I challenge some common um, orthodox principles around God's power,
Mhm.
otherwise known as omnipotence, God's knowledge, as we would call it, omniscience, God's immutability or perfection that
Mhm.
doesn't ever change, which also leads to the sense that God is not movable or responsive to real needs in real time. And so I want to access that conversation through some of those big ideas that we've inherited over the centuries, um, and in some ways have been misappropriated onto the Christian narrative and our theology um, through centuries of philosophical development, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes. So, on the one hand, I'm inviting people into a journey of moving away from that God
Mhm.
to a more generous, a more accessible, responsive, and certainly loving God. On the other hand, that after in the title also, I had hoped to imply the sense of pursuit,
Mhm.
right? So it's life in pursuit of
Yeah.
another kind of God. And
Mm.
so um, I don't know that I've accessed that much for people in conversations I've had with people about that. It just people get stuck on the leaving behind, and I think that's part of the big conversation that's in the world right now about Christian deconstruction. Right?
Yeah, I think for me, like that was the biggest takeaway for me from the book. Like there's a lot of things in this book to explore, and you have a lot of really great ideas and thoughts that you bring up. But for me, like this is something that I've been really thinking through a lot just in my own personal journey over the last couple of years, and I think a lot of podcast episodes like this and conversations that I
Mhm,
get to have with people like you kind of help me put language on different things. But your
mhm,
book was really helpful in putting language on this particular issue, and that is that there's like this very big difference between
mhm,
no longer believing in God, no longer believing in Jesus or the Bible or the church or whatever, and just no longer believing in the stuff that I was taught regarding those things. Because
mhm,
I get that like all the time with the podcast. I've had some family members, and I told you like before about my seminary and some friends like get all up in my grill, that they can't believe you've given
mhm,
up on God and you've let Jesus go. You no longer believe the Bible. Like I thought I knew you. Like,
mhm.
who are you? Who are you turning into? And I'm like, hold up.
Uh,
Like, I never said any of that. Like, I still love God very much. I still love Jesus. In fact, I still love the Bible. I just don't believe in a lot of those man-made theologies or pieces of dogma or whatever it is that
mm,
surround those things so much, like in our experience. And like personally, like I no longer care about biblical inerrancy. I don't really
mhm,
care that much about atonement theories or these deep
mhm.
theological discussions where we go back and forth about who's right and who's wrong. I used to thrive on those things. I love those kind of
Yeah.
conversations, but nowadays I'm just like, like it doesn't really do it for me. Like it just feels irrelevant to me. It doesn't have to be that way for everybody. Some people might find a lot of life in that, and that's great. But it's just kind of where I'm at. Like I'm finding meaning in regards to God and Jesus and the Bible and all these things, like in much different places these days. So the book helped me put
Well,
language on all of that.
yeah, and you're naming one of the reasons I wrote the book is to give people some of that language to enter into those conversations that otherwise can turn immediately to Christian gaslighting.
Hmm.
And there's there's no species of human on the planet that's better at gaslighting others than the Christian species, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I mean, like, how can you believe that, or how can you not believe this? Um, and that immediately shuts down and shames and triggers folks into a defensive position,
Yeah.
and it just blocks conversation and creativity and the pursuit of God.
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, you talk about it in the book about the omnipotence of God, God being all powerful, and God being this amazing being who can do all things, who's in control of everything. And like I lived my life that way for the longest
Mhm.
time. And then in like 20, I think it was 2015, my wife and I had a miscarriage. And that
Mm,
set everything off for me. Cause I remember, and I've told this story in the podcast before, but like we were in the hospital and we were getting ready to go, and I went out to get the car to pull up to pick up my wife, and I was just screaming at God, like, how could you do this? Like, you are supposed to be all powerful, you're supposed to take care of your people. What is the
mm,
matter with you? Like, I was ready to just give up everything at that point. Like, I had been through Bible college, seminary, all the things. I was like, this no longer makes any sense to me, that God is this all powerful being who would just allow this to happen. But then, I started to go down the rabbit trail of, not just that kind of scenario, but like, what about people who are raped? What about children who are molested? Like, if God is all powerful, why is God allowing this stuff to happen? Like, either God is not all powerful or God is all powerful and therefore he's a monster. And that just kind of set all these kind of questions off in my head that you explore so well in this book, that I think, if we allow our minds to go there, we can kind of see how some of these theologies don't always make a whole lot of sense in the midst of our lived experiences in life.
yeah, as I say in the book, for a lot of people, faith is either killed or maimed at the intersection of human suffering
Yeah.
and God's power.
Yeah.
So as you know, the word for this conversation and the paradox is theodicy.
Mhm.
And I will say, for me personally, this work that I've been doing for now 30 plus years, really the entryway for me was theodicy. This question about, if God is all loving, uh, then and God is all powerful, then why essentially do bad things happen? If God can stop these things, and for me personally, I can access that immediately in my own life, in my own narrative. in my own traumas throughout my life.
Mm.
And as a pastor for 30 years, I see it played out sometimes weekly with people going through tragedy, going through some of the experiences you just named, and being at a table in my office with a mother whose son has perished in a rollover accident at the age of 16, and asking literally, how could this happen? Um, and what I would hope I can do as a pastor is have these kind of conversations about God's power and God's love on a regular, consistent basis from the pulpit and through our classes and through counseling and conversations, so that people begin to have these new tools to be thinking about God, because in some way we will all go through that intersection
Yeah.
of uh, of tragedy and hardship and questioning God's power.
Mm.
And I'm shaped by a theological system, if you will, called process theology.
Mm.
There are other expressions which I think are very accessible, open and relational theology. And generally speaking, in both of those camps, theologians and pastors, practitioners would begin the conversation by saying, if we're going to affirm an all-loving God, we have to begin to redefine how we understand God's power.
Yeah.
And is God's power defined as a kind of coercive, unilateral divine power? Or are there other ways that can still affirm that God is a powerful God, but not one whom we can anticipate intervening in moments, supernatural intervention in moments of trauma and tragedy, and whether that's personal or global? And so in the first chapter of the book, that's sort of how I begin the conversation,
Yeah.
and to try to name it as maybe for most people one of the most real and pressing, urgent questions that we go through.
Yeah. I'm assuming you've heard of Tom Ord and his book
Yeah,
God
yeah,
Can't. Yeah.
Tom's a great friend, and we studied at the School of Theology at Claremont School of Theology now, and so we come from that same process tradition.
Yeah.
Studied under John Cobb and David Ray Griffin and Marjorie Suhaki, and some great minds.
Yeah. Yeah, he was one of the first people to introduce me to that whole idea when I read his book God Can't, and he came on the show and he really helped me unpack a lot of that experience about the miscarriage and answer a lot
Right.
of those questions for me, because I was, you know, looking at God as like the puppeteer kind of thing, and that's just how I understood God. But when he helped me see God in a different light, in the sense that that night in the hospital when we got the news, like God's power was in the fact that God was there, and that God's power was in the fact that God was grieving and is grieving with us, and God's power was in the fact that we were not left alone or abandoned in the midst of all of that. And once I started to kind of redefine God's power a little bit, it just kind of helped me not be so angry at God, after that experience.
And I think many people who are afraid to enter into the conversation about God's power
Mhm.
hear this and say, well, what you're saying is, that God doesn't have any power then.
Mhm.
If God can't intervene supernaturally and make things happen unilaterally, then there are limits on God's power. Um, I think, and I try to describe in the book, and Tom Ord does a great job in his latest book on amipotence, as he calls it, that that the way we've interpreted some of these words in Scripture, in particular the word El Shaddai,
Mm.
uh, and how that word over the last 300 years or so has been interpreted as meaning Almighty, when in fact many of the ancient rabbis would say, no, it really means the breasted one.
Mm.
So it's not the Almighty God, but the God with breasts, the one who, in other words, responds to our experiences with deep compassion, like a mother or a father, the tenderness of God. And there's deep power in that. And we know this. We know we know that in our human relationships, that tenderness, that persuasion rather than coercion, um, is in some ways a far more powerful force in the world than
Mhm.
making anybody do anything, right?
Yeah.
And so, how do we begin to flip the conversation about God's power from one of coercion to one of persuasion and responsiveness and love? And that's what
Yeah.
I hope to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, it's so good. All right, so on the in this vein of thinking, you have these two chapters in the book that I thought were super interesting. One is, I think it's just called shh, like shh,
Yeah,
and the other is called psst, and it's
yeah,
like the sh, and I correct me if I'm not explaining it the best, but it's like the sh of the church, or
yeah,
the
yeah,
sh of the internal soldier, and the
mhm,
psst, like the tap on the shoulder of
yeah,
God. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take us, now that I threw that out there for our listeners and they have no idea what I'm talking about, if you could take
mm,
us into that conversation a little bit and show us a bit about
yeah,
that dynamic.
yeah. Each of the chapters in the book are titled after a sound,
Hmm.
and as just a way to bring people into a more open and creative approach to these conversations. So
Hmm.
um, that sound of shh is what a growing number of people who identify as Christians or have felt, especially over the last generation or so. Um, that is the silencing and shaming voice of the church,
Hmm.
of the sort of collective Christian conscience, right?
Hmm.
That says you can't say those things, you can't think those things, you can't ask those things. And what I encounter so often in my ministry, and a number of different scenarios, right? So sometimes I'll encounter somebody who's maybe 65 or older in my church who will say, my kids don't come to church. They grew up in the church and they have never returned once they left. And I can't get them to come back. Um, and and what I try to explain to them is um, for many of them, the questions that they've had that have gone unanswered or ignored or silenced for so long have finally edged them out completely of that experience. There are others whom I encounter in the church who will say to me, you are saying things in church that I've always thought but have never felt safe to
Yeah.
say or ask about.
Yeah.
Then there are others who come to my church who come from an evangelical background, who identify now as, say, post-evangelical, and who come with a great deal of spiritual trauma in their life. And they've been silenced forever, and they, for some reason or other, have wandered into my church and have felt again safe to ask those questions that they were shamed or uh, even sort of excommunicated from their communities because of either what they thought or what they went through, whether that was um, a divorce or um, an expression of love and relationship that doesn't conform to um, evangelical standards. And so what I'm trying to do is open up that conversation from that silencing um, to knowing that it's okay to ask these questions. And I described that when we start doing this, that our faith starts to feel a little bit like a Jenga puzzle, right? And we start pulling out these blocks, and it gets pretty scary. And so sometimes the that we hear is our own of um, like we're going into ground and territory that feels off limits, and we're afraid to see that Jenga tower collapse. So um, I sort of juxtapose that with this other sound, the psst sound, which is um, how I try to identify the work of God in the world and in our lives. That we have these experiences. Sometimes they're audible, sometimes they're visceral, sometimes they're visual, but we have these experiences or encounters in the world in which we sense that God is calling us. In the process construct, we might describe God as the lure, or the woo, the divine woo, who, instead of coming to us from behind and pushing or shoving us in directions we don't want to go, is out in front of us, calling us, beckoning to us to say, as I describe in the book, you could be this, you could become this, if you so choose. And so that is a more persuasive understanding of who God is and how God works in the world. And I think it's the better alternative to the more common understanding of a coercive, forceful God. And
Yeah.
so, how do we
Yeah.
open ourselves up to?
Yeah, I feel like for me that's been the journey that I've been on with this podcast because in talking to you before just about my experience growing up, and I grew up, it was a very evangelical world I grew up in, and the Bible college I went to, and the seminary and things like that, and very steeped in like the systematic theology classes, and there were just certain things that you did not ask, you did not question. And even if it didn't make any sense, the answer was you got to have more faith. The answer was you just got to believe, and one day when you die and you get to heaven, it all makes sense because God will explain it all. But for now, if you're going to walk on the water, you got to have the faith kind of thing. You can't look at the questions you have. You get to keep focused. And that was like always my mentality, was that, just quiet the questions. And then I remember I read Rob Bell's Love Wins when I got out of, I think it was just when I got out of seminary. And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, I never really could latch on to the whole hell thing, like, completely.
Yeah.
And I always steered clear of it in my teachings and things like that in churches and stuff because I never felt super comfortable with it. So I was one of those things where I got just be quiet with the feelings and just believe it. And then when I read this book, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's a whole like another stream of thinking around this topic. And then I started to wonder, well, if that's true with this topic, what about other topics that I have only been told about with one way? And I felt like that, like you just described, was like the lore of God, because a lot of people said, well, you can't go to that book because that's not God speaking. I'm like, well, how do you know that's not God speaking? Maybe God's not going to speak to you through that book. That's fine. But I can sense that lore. I can sense that pull, that welcoming spirit to come and explore. And that kind of led me down that trail. And then I started to go down the trail of, thinking about like the second coming and like all those kind of things and all these big theologies that were so important to me growing up. And I'm like, man, I had no idea that was such a narrow way of thinking. I thought I thought this was it. I didn't realize there were all these other streams of thinking as well to go and explore. And so I think that that's really good terminology to use, the sh versus the psst of God.
Yeah, you're naming all the big questions,
Mm,
right? How does this all going to end? What is the nature of salvation?
mhm,
What's the purpose of the cross? Is it atonement? How do we read Scripture? Every time we ask one of those questions, the instinctive sound that we hear, either coming from within
mhm.
and or coming from without, is be quiet.
Yeah,
We've got centuries of thought on this, and it's all settled, and it's been settled. And you start messing with those Jenga blocks, and you might be messing with your eternal fate, right? And
yeah,
so, if you don't get it, and you named it, right? The message is, if you don't get it, it's all mystery, and
yep,
someday you'll understand what you can't understand today.
yep.
I just think that doesn't work
Mhm,
um, with the generation that my kids belong to. From 30 to 20, they don't even understand that, and they grew up in the church. They grew up watching me preach, but they don't understand that language and
yeah,
that way of thinking.
yeah, it's really good. All right, so in the book, I don't know. I feel like the book was very. I said this to a friend the other day. I'm like, there. So what was this book like? I'm like, it's like a Rob Bell book because you really
Mhm.
write in that very same kind of style, but you also write in a way that you you come at like these topics, you come at these Bible stories, and you look at them from these radical angles. Like like you'd be talking about a story. I'm like, oh, I know where he's going with this, but then all of a sudden it's like out of right field to come with this idea. I'm like, oh my goodness, like I never thought of it like that. And one of the stories that's really stuck with me, even after reading the book, is the story of Moses and the burning bush. And so I was wondering if you could just kind of take our listeners into your kind of style of thinking about some of these stories and maybe talk a little bit about Moses and the burning bush, because like for me, it
Yeah.
was always about Moses comes up to this bush, it's on fire. He experiences this omnipotent, all powerful, amazing God. He has this experience and it teaches him all this wild stuff about God. But in the book, you talk about how maybe that burning bush was really showing Moses something really important about himself that perhaps maybe even he had lost sight of at some point in his life. And that just blew my mind wide open. So if you could take us into that a little bit to give our listeners a taste, that would be great.
Yeah, and you're naming sort of my hermeneutic as
Mm,
I approach every text. I try to approach it from an open relational or process perspective to say, I have to read this text absent of these big ideas that I no longer believe:
mm,
omnipotence, supernaturalism,
mm,
that God intervenes in these dramatic, miraculous ways. I know that opens up a whole host of other questions, but um, and so when I read the story of the burning bush, I read it as the broader narrative of Moses, who really is a homicidal fugitive at the time, right?
mm,
He's left Egypt after having killed a taskmaster, and he is settling in Midian, marries Zipporah, and is feeding sheep and leading sheep and shearing sheep, and life is just it's good enough,
mm,
and he's settling. And yet, what prompted that response back in Egypt and that led to the killing of that taskmaster is this deep, deep hatred for slavery
mm,
and this deep, deep passion for liberation for his people. And so, out in Midian, tending sheep, that fire has gone out in his life. The passion for doing something bigger and more important and more meaningful is has just gone out. And so he has this experience in which he sees a bush on fire, and then the question is, is this a story about a miracle in which God ignites bushes that don't get fully consumed, or is there something deeper in the story? The ancient rabbis, often in the midrashic tradition, taught on this story and said there's an interesting connection between the flames in the Hebrew word and the heart in Moses, and there's a linguistic connection between these two. So maybe what Moses sees in the bush is not actual flames of fire, but he sees himself, and the bush is a representative or a symbol of his own life,
mm,
which even out of Midian hasn't been consumed.
mm,
The fire hasn't gone completely out, and in that moment, he comes to see that the passion that he once had has been rekindled, and so of course that leads him to this new mission. I think the burning bush is an example of that we just talked about, and it doesn't have to happen supernaturally. And so, is the bush really on fire? I think to ask the question and try to answer it is to miss the point,
mm.
um, because what Moses perceived was the call of God, which had never been extinguished. He just had ignored it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that's like the talk about like that's your hermeneutic for reading the scriptures. I feel like for me, growing up, it was always about, was the bush really on fire? Did
Mhm.
Jesus really walk on the water? Like all those kinds of
Yeah.
questions about like the nuances of the text, where nowadays I'm like, I don't know. But the bigger question is like, why has this story endured for thousands and thousands of years to the point where it's sitting on my shelf right up there. Like, what is it about this story that has captured humanity's attention? And I feel like what a great encouragement that is to so many people who are listening, because like we all go through things in life. Like, my father passed away in March, and so it sent me into this really dry season, just of like feeling blah, like nothing that mattered feels like it matters as much anymore. And, it feels like the fire, so to speak, has gone out. But that idea that like Moses sitting in his place, feeling like maybe that fire went out, then having this encounter with the divine, reflecting back at him that indeed the fire is burning, and maybe burning brighter than it's ever burned before, and that kind of leads him into a new season of his life. And I think that for our listeners, like regardless of what we're going through, whether it's a significant loss, it's a 9 to 5 job that we hate at the moment, or whatever it is that has us feeling dry, that fire is still flickering inside. I think that that's a beautiful point that story can bring out.
And I think if we pay attention to our lives, as I say in the book, those burning bushes really are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to really be there in those moments of despair and those desert experiences, in which we're not feeling much and
Yeah.
we're numb, and so for me that's a formative story, and it speaks about how God most often works.
All right. So last question for you. I said to you before, a lot of our listeners are at this place where they're rethinking their faith. Some of them are kind of on the verge of maybe letting it all go, letting go of God and the Bible, church, all the different things. But people email me a lot and they tell me, some of their story. I see it in the comment sections. Some people have been under that umbrella of toxic theology that you mentioned earlier. Some people have experienced spiritual abuse. Some people have been in homes, growing up where the theologies they were hit with have left them feeling wounded. So as a pastor, someone who has people in front of him on a regular basis, kind of asking these types of questions, feeling these kinds of ways, like if those people are on the mic with us today, what are some words that you would leave them with?
I would encourage people to begin uh, that discernment by either actually writing a list or at least making a mental list of those things that they know to be true, those experiences that they know to be real, that they know to be um, revelations, epiphanies, brushes with the divine, however you want to frame it. But those that tend those that shaped who we are and that became aha moments, um, even if they exist outside the conventions of Christian orthodoxy, and just to hold those. I mean,
Mm,
behold them, honor them, love them, and don't let any voices outside of those experiences diminish them or reduce them to less than
mm,
important or meaningful. And then make another list of those things that they don't believe but haven't really harmed them. Um,
mm,
they just don't like them. They don't make sense to them. They haven't experienced them. Um, and it could be any number of things that we already talked about. But to make a list of those things that they could or couldn't be true for me, I don't know, and to
mm,
hold those in tension so that we don't dismiss them just because we haven't experienced them, but to hold them as I describe in the book as sort of generous antagonists
mm.
who can help mentor us and stretch us into new understandings, to not let them go too quickly. And then the third list is make a list of all those things that just have to go. Um, and I describe it as the work of, like picking these things up like rodents by the tail and taking them out the front
Get out of
door
here.
or the
Right.
back door and letting them go. And if they come back, then you know get the hose or the shovel or the shoe or whatever and make them go away. It's
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
because those are the most serious threat to our experience of the divine,
Yeah.
um, and um, and we don't need them anymore.
I think that first list is key because a lot of times when people enter this world of, you want to call it deconstruction or whatever it is you want to, whatever word you want to throw on it, it's very easy to go to list number 2 and 3, right? And talk about all the things that bother me or all the things that have hurt me, and we want to throw the rats out. We want to throw the rodents out. But I love that
Yeah,
first list is that, thinking about the things that are worth holding on to, because it wasn't necessarily all bad. Maybe a lot of it was. Maybe a lot of it has left us wounded. But I look back on my own life, and once I got past that emotionally charged feeling of anger, of, being told that my faith is so narrow, and in reality, it was actually very diverse in the early centuries, and there's a lot of different ways to think about Jesus and things like that. Like once I got past that feeling of being lied to or whatever it is that I was feeling inside, I was able to kind of put those emotions aside. I was able to kind of reassess my faith, and reassess a lot of the things that I learned, and like, thinking about my church experiences, my seminary experiences, like it wasn't all bad. There's a lot of things in there that are worth holding on to. So what are those things? Like you said, naming them, but then also putting those side by side with the things that maybe have hurt and have bothered us, and hold those things in some kind of tension together and move on from there. I think that's really, really sound advice.
we need the tension,
Yep.
and that can be a real generous friend. Even if those things that we have to get rid of have to exist outside the doors to our heart,
Yeah.
you know, they'll go away.
Yeah.
And I've been playing with this image of like, I mean, I know the word deconstruction is huge, but
Hmm.
um, I, I preached recently that there's this one of the most common dreams that humans have. I don't know if you've had it, but I have it frequently, and that's that I'm in my own house, um, and I just by accident happen to find some hallway that leads to a room that I never knew existed in my own house.
Mm.
Right? Um, it shows up on a top 10 list for dreams for humans. And a lot of people I talk to say, "No, I've never had that dream. That's weird." But you go into these other rooms, or you go
Yeah.
down a basement stairway, and there's all this room with all this stuff, and you can live there. And
Mm.
so I think deconstruction is one way to talk about what we're doing. Another way is just to move into a different room,
Mm.
and dare to live there for a while. So
Yeah. It's like, I'm trying to think of a word for it. It's almost like it's like faith expansion. I don't know what the word would be. I'm
yeah,
trying to think of like a word like expansion, renovation, not renovation, because you're, I don't know,
yeah,
discovery, right? Because you're discovering a new room, a new place. Yeah. Because
yeah,
that word deconstruction carries so much baggage with it. And it's such
yeah.
a, speaking of emotionally charged, it's such an emotionally charged word these days in a lot of circles. So I think using different words to describe the same idea, I think that's helpful.
Right.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
we are just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your work. And thank you for making time for us.
Glenn, it's been a joy. These are important conversations, and what a gift it is to have a conversation with you and with your listeners, and maybe kick in some of those doors and see what's down the hallway.
Yeah. Thank you. And real quick, where can people go online to connect with you, your work, any kind of social media platforms you want to plug real quick?
Yeah, I mean, I got a website, markfeldmeir.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on X and Threads, and
X.
you can
Yep.
whatever they're all
Whatever
called
it
now.
is.
Yeah, and a lot of my got some videos through the St. Andrew website. Go to standrew.com, where you can kind of listen in and hear how I interpret text and things like that. I'm also more than happy for readers with groups that are reading the book. I'm happy to jump on calls and for a time and talk about the book with larger groups. So
Awesome. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes, and I'm sure we'll do this again sometime.
awesome. It's great to be with you, Glenn. Thank you
Thanks so
so
much.
much.
Yeah.